Hi Jay,
Welcome. How you doing?
I'm all right. What time is it in Texas?
Well, I'm in Tennessee, but it's 4 p.m. here.
Oh, okay. Okay, there we go. Is that good? The
Yeah,
camera?
yeah. You sound good. Yeah, looks good.
Okay.
Can
Let me
everybody?
know when we're ready to go on.
Yeah, we're ready. We're going now. If that's okay.
That's fine.
All right, we're live. Can everybody hear us good? Looks like the sound's good. And today we're going to be talking about more of the historical geopolitical influences in the last several hundred years between East and West. Of course, we can't overlook the British Empire, right? In terms of looking at the relationship between Islam and the West. And I have with me today, of course, Sheikh Asrar Rashid. He is a pretty well known Islamic scholar, philosopher, revered authority. And so, thank you for coming and chatting with us. I know that we've talked about having a debate down the road, and I want to be fair to you and finish the books that you recommended. And I've been so busy, I just haven't had a chance to. But we definitely want to have this geopolitical talk, find areas of commonality and places where we agree. So, is there anything that I left out there that you want to touch on in terms of your background and who you are? And I gave a link to your Facebook there. Is there anything else you want the viewers to know about you?
Yes, so I wanted to mention to our viewers, uh, Muslims and Christians alike and others, that Jay and I have agreed to debate. The date has not yet been finalized because of certain issues with being busy with writing and whatnot. But more recently, I had an exchange with Jay, and I gave Jay some recommendations of what to read in terms of Islamic theology, Ilmul Kalam. So he is busy with reading that. I myself have been doing research on Saint Justinian's formation of Christology and so much more of the Eastern Orthodox literature, because in the West, generally, we are exposed to Protestant and Catholic literature, which is totally different to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. But
Right.
a great opening by yourself with regard to Islam's relationship with the West. And I would like to start on that footing with regard to Charlemagne, for instance. In the early days, when the Muslims did conquer North Africa, we, as Muslims, meaning where the terms the Turks, the Moors, the Turks is a later uh, term phraseology utilized with regard to the Muslims, because the Turks entered Islam much later. So the earliest exposure to Muslims was with the Arab expansions into Christian territory.
Mm-hmm.
So from the five major Christian cities, Constantinople, Rome, Damascus, Alexandria, and that's four of the major Christian cities. The Muslims had conquered Alexandria, uh, Jerusalem, and Damascus up to that point, later Constantinople. So, as it stands today, Muslim majority area, those four cities are Muslim majority today. In So, this of course led to a clash between an early clash between Islam and Christianity. So, the Western Christianity, which uh, today we would say it's evolved, or you can say devolved into Anglo-Euro
Yeah.
secularism.
Right.
Western Christianity has devolved into Anglo-Euro secularism, stereotype the Muslim as the more, and even the dark skin, the black African more, the stereotyping of the Muslim as being dark skinned, or Africa being associated intricately with Islam. The first clash came with Charlemagne. So even in America, you have Bill Clinton, who received the Charlemagne Award, meaning, and the award is named after Charlemagne. Charlemagne and his father, both who stopped the incursions of the Arabs into southern France. So this period was the formative period of how Islam and Western Christianity, more specifically, clashed. While on the Eastern Orthodox front, you have how the Muslims entered Jerusalem. And you can probe me on that later when the Muslims did enter Jerusalem. And I'm sure you visited the Church of the Sepulchre, the Holy Sepulchre, in Jerusalem, how the guardian of the church is actually a Muslim, two guardians who are Muslims and have been guardians of the church for 1400 years. There is a history to that, which many of your viewers should be made familiar of. So the inception point of Islam's relationship with the West is from that incursion into these areas, the expansionism, which now George Bush more recently stereotyped that as saying the Muslims just want a caliphate that extends from east to west, meaning total expansionism, which is untrue. We as Muslims see that as the expansion was done for emancipating Christian groups. In fact, Christians in Egypt at the time welcomed the Muslim conquerors when they entered Egypt, and the same in Syria, which was majority Christian, for 400 years plus after the Muslims had conquered Syria. And additionally, the only time the attitudes changed towards the Muslims was after the Crusades. Now, the Crusades were a Western venture, nothing to do with Eastern Orthodox Christianity. As we know, which crusade was it that which the crusade was against Eastern Orthodox Christians was the Fifth Crusade, I think, when they entered Constantinople and ransacked the churches, killed Christians, Eastern Orthodox Christians. Those same crusaders, as I mentioned, the formative period of the relationship of Islam today with the Western world was from that time of Charlemagne up to the First Crusades. And this includes, by the way, 1066, when William the Conqueror from Normandy entered into our British Isles. At that time, it was not Britain. So the islands were, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland were not united. But he entered England in 1066. When he entered England in 1066, he sacked England for its silver and for its riches, for the church. And I make it clear for my Muslim listeners, the Roman Catholic Church. And we have now the Roman Catholic Pope going to Iraq and calling for peace, but not mentioning what has caused the division in Iraq. What has caused the division in Iraq during the rule of Saddam Hussein, the Christians, in fact, Tariq Aziz was a Christian. He was one of the generals in the army of Saddam Hussein. He was a Christian. So what has caused the division? So in 1066, when the Roman Church sanctioned the invasion of England specifically, 33 years later, in 1099, a very important event occurred. What was that important event? Meaning, historically speaking, it was the invasion of Jerusalem at the hands of the First Crusaders, only 33 years apart. And when they invaded Jerusalem to take Jerusalem back for the Christian world, it was not representative of Christianity because they killed Christians also who were residing in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And the historians mentioned that the blood was up to knee high at that point. So I want to initiate our discussion from this inception point of how the relationship between what we know today as the Anglo-Euro world, which is Europe, mainland Europe, and America. You have Europe and America and Britain in the middle. The relationship of the Anglosphere, which includes New Zealand, Australia, even though I would make an exception with regard to New Zealand in many things, but New Zealand, Australia, South Africa to a degree prior to apartheid ending, and wherever you had European expansionism, including modern day Israel, the relationship of this bloc, Anglo-Euro power bloc, with the Muslim world started at that point. So from Charlemagne to the Crusades, and then the colonial period in the 1700s, and interestingly enough, when America was founded. So your country, America, which is a new, it was in its embryonic stage at that point. And the relationship of America in the 1700s and early 1800s was different with the Muslim world with the Ottomans specifically than what it is today. What led to this, and how was America led down the route that it has been led down, meaning with its foreign policies? The founding fathers or the American people at that time had total different attitudes towards the Muslim world, but now the attitudes in America have changed. So this is what I wanted to start our discussion on today.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. I'm glad that you hit on some of the topics that I had in mind too. And one thing I would point out is that from the Orthodox Christian perspective, I put a couple links into the chat for those that are watching, which are a couple historical books that cover Charlemagne. And for the Orthodox, Charlemagne is a clear point of departure, right? So for us in 800 AD, from the Orthodox perspective, there was already a Byzantine emperor. And so the idea that the Latin Church would anoint in 800 AD a separate emperor for the West, really, unfortunately, within a few centuries under the Frankish papacy, becomes a tool of politics. It becomes a geopolitical tool. And this is one of the nuances of history, is that in many, many cases, religion, unfortunately, does become a tool of some political leader. I'm not saying that there should be no relationship between religion and politics. Orthodoxy does classically affirm that relationship, that God is Lord of politics as much as he is the Lord of the religious realm too. So that is also a Protestant deviation, ultimately, that has its roots in European papal humanism, the divide between the secular and the sacred realm. For us, that doesn't really exist classically. But just to emphasize again that it is important to remember that in the Orthodox perspective, we see ourselves as continuing the legacy of the Byzantine Empire in terms of the philosophy and the theology. So I'm not saying that we have some secret Byzantine emperor somewhere, but obviously if you look at the czars of Russia, they're kind of taking on the mantle of the idea of a divinely anointed political a king who rules under God. So that's one misconception that a lot of people have about. They'll conflate Western Christianity, even amongst liberal variants of Orthodoxy. They'll think that Christianity is somehow a religion that posits that God shouldn't be the king of politics. He should be, and he is. Now, whether people live up to that is a different question. And again, I would definitely just stress that it is correct to go back to the medieval and Renaissance period to look for the divergence between East and West in Christianity. And it's not just a philosophical debate between, do Orthodox accept the Pope? Do we do that? It's also these geopolitical factors that, for example, not too long after the schism, the Western Church goes into what's called the Great Western Schism, where you have three different popes. You have the Avignon Papacy, where the papacy moves to France, and you get these three different claimants, people all claiming to be the Pope, the true Pope. So for us, that just demonstrates with a couple easy examples from history that the attitude of Christianity in the West went in a different direction, and it became very geopolitical. And one of the key critiques that we will make as Orthodox of the papacy is that precisely because it tried to take on the role of geopolitical commander, it basically surrendered itself to the world in an unfortunate way. Beyond what is correct from our perspective, right? There's always, again, a relationship of synergy between church and state from our view, but the papacy tried to become this entity that would be an international corporate geopolitical power, and that's what's problematic for us just on the geopolitical level of history. And that leads to so many problems in the West. And so in other words, I would agree with the characterization that you've given so far of the relationship between where
the interesting point you mentioned with regard to the Protestant church is the legalization of interest-based banking.
I was going to bring that up next, yes.
And how the world economy today is based on interest-based banking, as well as with Islam. In Islam, we have a political system, which, of course, many of you are aware of, and which is known as the Caliphate. Now, the Caliphate would ban interest-based banking. So that's the first clash for allowing any Islamic self-determination in Muslim majority countries. So if there was self-determination economically in any Muslim country today, where the Muslim groups would rise to ascendancy, they would one of the first things that they should be doing is banishing interest-based banking, and we know that the effects of the IMF loans on developing countries or the abused world, the slavery, the modern slavery, and the corporation taxes, the corporations, and the amount of human abuse or human trafficking that occurs just because of interest and interest-based banking. So the roots of modernity of the postmodern world and what we have, the power structure that we have, which is pure expansionism, not only for land, but pure expansionism for wealth and plundering different nations. It happens to be that the Muslims are majority in those places where those resources are found. So in Arabia, for instance, oil is found. Throughout Turkey, Syria, Iraq, all these regions are full of resources, and the Muslims happen to be the majority people in those areas. And they have a 1300-year-old caliphate that ruled in that region. So the caliphate lasted 1300 years, a system of governance, and it came to an end with its clash with Britain. So your initial question with regard to Islam's relationship with colonial Britain, that started from the time of the Crusades. But I mentioned Charlemagne to bring in how the Normandy thinking entered UK. At that time, it was England, and you had the Normans ruling England and forming what we have today, the royal family and the ruling elite. That most of the English barons and landowners are from that period of time, meaning the invaders from France. So this talk of being English, they are not originally from the island itself. They are from Europe. So the Anglo-Saxon people, power was removed from them, and they would look down on the Anglo-Saxon people. So from that time, 1099, until now, the foreign policy has changed towards the Muslims and the attitude towards Muslims. So we have the development of this during the colonial period. So that's where we enter the dismantling of the Islamic Caliphate and how that occurred. So which goes hand in hand with the founding of Zionism. So in the 1800s, you had Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, attempting to buy land from the Ottoman Caliphate. So he offered Sultan Abdul Hamid II coins. The interesting thing that the currency was gold at that time. So he offered thousands of gold coins for Palestine at that time. So the project Palestine, or the project Israel, the inception of that was in the late 1800s, which coincided with the founding of the body of Ramesses II. So the body of Ramesses II, the body of Pharaoh, who was the tyrant who persecuted the Jews, as told in the Bible and told in the Quran, his body is found in the period when Zionism as a philosophy is formed in the UK, and you would know of the role of the Rothschild family with regard to the finding of Zionism, and then the Balfour Declaration in 1917, when Lord Balfour just wrote a note to Lord Rothschild, Nathan Rothschild at that time, declaring a Jewish homeland which was yet to be found. So the project Palestine, the roots go back to the Crusades. So the Crusades had not finished. This is from a Muslim perspective. The Crusades had not finished from 1099 up to 1917. The Crusades had not finished, and Jerusalem was captured by the British at that time. And there was also an alliance between the British and the Zionist Jews in Palestine for espionage. There is literature written on espionage, Jewish espionage for the British, for the colonialists in that period. And there was collusion also in so many things. That recently there was a report, a leak of incidents that occurred where there was clear collusion between the Jewish Zionists and the British colonialists at that time, which was unknown to the public. So that has become, meaning if you claim such things at that time, uh, uh, like Hitler's fire of the fire of the German Parliament, if you claimed
The
at that time that
Reichstag.
yeah, that there was collusion, then you would be the term conspiracy theorist is a more of a recent, it has come into common parlance more recently, but decades later, this has been determined as being fact. So the development of British espionage into the Muslim world
Mm-hmm.
and utilizing different factions to fight one another, to disintegrate any governance in those lands. And it continues today with Blackwater operations
Mm-hmm.
and other things.
Sure, exactly. One thing I would say about that is first that when it comes to usury, it's interesting because usually this is talked about in terms of the Talmud, and certainly the Talmud and the traditional medieval Jewish mindset believed that usury was something that could be done. But the power structure in the West wasn't Jewish, right? The power structure was papal. And when you get to the Renaissance papacy is where you actually begin to see what had formerly been rejected even in the Latin West of the church, right? So from the Orthodox perspective, the church is united for the first 1,000 years. And then in the second half, when it's split, the West went its own way. It's ironic because the papacy, right, makes all these innovations. They actually begin to adopt and promote usury. And so if you read Hoffman's book on usury, he notes this point. And so ironically, it's actually the papacy that got usury going in the West because they were the power structure, right? They had the power. Um, uh, Rabbis didn't have all the power in the West in the Middle Ages, right? So the irony is that that's what kicks off this tendency towards the ability to have this rapacious attitude to enslave nations, right, through usury.
They
And
would, in fact, demonize the Jews and use the Jews as a scapegoat. Even when Richard the Lionheart was crowned in Britain, there were anti-Jewish riots broke out
yeah,
in England at that time. But that was because the papacy and the ruling elite would utilize Jews to do the legwork
correct.
and the banking for them. So the Jews were used as a scapegoat in
Right.
history.
Yeah, I mean, and the Rothschilds have been the papal bankers since the 1700s. That's not a conspiracy. That's public Jewish encyclopedia knowledge. So we know that what appears to happen is that the banking powers attain tremendous influence, tremendous wealth, and they can then sort of bankrupt, right, the nation states at will. And in my view, the British Empire pretty much becomes a kind of a Rothschild banking empire. And that's the locus of the power is that. There's a lot of factors as to why they wanted to create that, the Balfour Declaration, Sykes-Picot, divide up the Middle East and create the nation of Israel. And there is certainly a religious motivation on the part of some of the Zionist Jews like Moses Hess and people like that who saw the secular nation state of Israel as itself a kind of salvific power for the world or something like that. So even secular Zionism still had these kind of religious roots and presuppositions. But all of that just to say that, yes, that is correct. And then the establishment of the state of Israel, I viewed it as what it was supposed to be was an outpost for the British Empire in the Middle East, right? It would be this place that they would set up, right, for the advantage of the families like the Rothschilds that supported that. But it was also going to be this kind of intelligence outpost, and that kind of the Jews in Israel got tired of that, and so they had the what was it, the King David, right, bombing and that kind of stuff, and so they got tired of the imperial, right, situation, and then Israel kind of rose to be powerful on its
And what,
own.
what it's become now is an Australia type uh, illegal rulership of land,
Yeah,
which does away with the indigenous peoples and um, kills the people. And what happened with the Aborigines? Now they make 2 to 5% of Australia, and uh, the land initially belonged to the Australians. So from the time when Captain Cook landed in the late 1700s, the Aborigines were free people roaming that place. But what's happening in Palestine, claims are being made that there is no Palestinian identity because there was no Palestine before the formation of Israel, which technically it is true that there was no nationalistic Palestine. That's because it was the territory of the caliphate. So there was a caliphate ruling Palestine in which the Palestinians were subjects of the caliphate. So to say that there was no Palestinian state, this is what Israelis are indoctrinated with today. So they're indoctrinated with a few other things additionally, that there is no mention of Jerusalem in the Quran. If you ever discuss with an Israeli, they will tell you there is no mention of Jerusalem, in order to tell us that there is no importance of Jerusalem in Islam, therefore occupation of Jerusalem is justified.
Well, I understand. Yeah, I understand the line of argumentation that they have. I would. I mean, I'm not interested in defending that line of argument, but I would out maybe when we have our debate, I will ask the question about what exactly is the relevance of the temple and Jerusalem in terms of the Quran. But maybe that's for a different time. But one question I would ask is, I read multiple books on kind of an intelligence perspective analysis of the way that British intelligence would utilize different groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. And one thing that comes up is that there was a very sort of cynical attitude by some of the kind of higher level neoconservative think tanks and people at the RAND Corporation who thought it would be a good idea to hop upon the idea of crusade. And so when George Bush and people like that talked about a crusade, I think they meant it in a kind of a cynical way. I don't really think they believe in a religious attitude to this stuff, unless they believe in some kind of dark religion, perhaps. But would you agree with that? That the approach of the neoconservative
Interestingly, after Tony Blair, he left the UK and he became the peace envoy to the Middle East. So after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, he became the peace envoy to the Middle East. He went to meet the Pope and he declared himself as a Catholic. So whether he actually believed in those wars as a religious war or not, it's something that is between him and God.
Well, what I'm saying is that, I mean, the motivations and actions of these people typically doesn't match up to what they claim, right? George Bush has always claimed to be some kind of evangelical Christian, but I mean, I don't think there's any real evidence to support that. And I guess what I'm getting at is that, don't you think that it's typical, whether people claim to be Christians or whether it's people in Islamic circles in history, doesn't there tend to be the idea of turning those things to purely political ends, is I guess the question I'm asking.
Yes, so that, again, human needs, one of the human needs is a race for resources. So because of those resources, justification is sometimes needed in order to validate an unjust war. And that is what has occurred in the past, whether it's religious wars or atheist wars, like with communism. You mentioned the Islamic Brotherhood and how organizations were utilized by British intelligence. With regard to that, the Islamic Brotherhood, firstly, it was founded by a Sheikh Hassan al-Banna, who was a sincere Muslim. He was a sincere Muslim. Why sincere? In the sense that he lived in the post-Caliphate time, where he saw the undermining of his country, Egypt, from, remember, the French initially invaded Egypt in the late 1700s. So when Napoleon invaded Egypt in the late 1700s, you had the founding of the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was found, in fact, by Napoleon's soldiers, and then the British took hold of the Rosetta Stone, and it lies in the London Museum today.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Then you had the British takeover from the French, and you had the likes of Lord Cromer and other characters in the British play that ruled Egypt at that time. And what they did is meddle in religious affairs of Egypt. And this included undermining the authority of the main religious university in Egypt, which is Al-Azhar al-Sharif. Al-Azhar in Cairo is the most authoritative Islamic university, reformulated by Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Saladin. So Saladin reformulated the university. He didn't find he wasn't the founder of the university. The university was founded by the Fatimi dynasty, a Shia dynasty prior to him, but then he reformulated it as the main center of Sunni learning. So the British, when they meddled in Egyptian politics, they did that also with, for instance, cotton growing. People were forced to grow cotton. Why? So that the cotton can be utilized for British uniforms, for the British Army. But the Egyptians wanted to utilize the land for growing wheat and food and for their livestock. But this caused poverty in Egypt, not too unsimilar to the famine, the Bengal famine in India at the time also, because Britain was colonizing India at that time. So what Britain did is it meddled in religious affairs by placing even Freemasonic shuyukh, who were scholars, clerics of Islam, ostensibly, but they were a part of Masonic lodges that had been found in Egypt. So when the British entered these areas, they not only undermined the religions of the people of those lands, they also opened Masonic lodges in those places, recruiting the influential people.
Right.
So at the turn of the 1900s, you had the likes of Muhammad Abdu. Muhammad Abdu, his name Abduh, Muhammad Abdu. You had Rashid Rida, and a man known as Al-Afghani. Even though he was not Afghani, he was from Iran.
Yeah.
These shuyukh were placed in the Azhar to reformulate the creed of the Muslims to deny miracles. So miracles, which is an essential aspect of Islamic faith, like in Christianity, because with miracles, the believers, they observe the divine power of God Almighty. So a type of scientism was introduced into the Azhar University,
right,
and a materialistic philosophy. This materialistic philosophy influenced some of the sheikhs in the Azhar, who then advocated reformation and a reformist policy of Islamic law. So you see how the changing of the creed affected how they viewed political issues. So geopolitics is affected,
right,
whatever creed a person internalizes is how they view the world.
right.
So if someone has a passive view with regard to the resources and how the resources should be distributed amongst the poor, meaning in Islam we have a charitable outlook that the zakats should be redistributed amongst the poor and the resources must be shared. But if the religious beliefs become materialistic, this then materializes into or fleshes out as a corporate way of thinking, or we could say capitalist way of thinking. So one of the first acts of the British was to meddle in religious affairs. So they not only meddled in Egypt, they also did this in India. In India, initially they sent the Protestant type Christian missionaries into India and the Muslims in order to proselytize Western Protestant Christianity amongst Muslims in India. Why amongst Muslims? Because the Muslims were the most vocal, and the Muslims were the only group that actually carried out armed mutinies against the British in 1857, for instance. The Great Mutiny in 1857 was led by Muslims and who were killed in their thousands on the streets of Delhi at that time, hanged on the streets. So to undermine the Muslims, they needed to replace their religious beliefs with an alternative. Initially, the alternative was Protestant Christianity. And as you mentioned, Protestant Christianity is as Christian as George Bush. So it had no effect in the Indian subcontinent. In fact, the scholars of Islam, the book Izhar al-Haq, which was a Muslim polemical book against Christianity, was written in that period. And the author was exiled from India and sent onto the Andaman Islands. And then he moved from the Andaman Islands, he was permitted to go to Arabia. Um, Now, in that period, aside from setting up certain shuyukh who would tamper the creed in Egypt, new religious groups were founded in India at that time. So new sects and new cults. So America is not the only land of cults. You have cults in other parts of the world as well. New cults were founded, and they were planted within the Muslim community at that time to undermine any Muslim political agitation. So the Brotherhood, the Islamic Brotherhood, was a reaction to the British policies in Egypt. So Hassan al-Banna was a sincere Muslim who wanted to return the Muslims back to their former glory. But what we observe from the 1930s onwards, after the passing away, later after the passing away of Hassan al-Banna, there was political interplay between Islamic political groups in the Middle East and the regimes. So you will find propaganda regarding these groups in four places. Either in mainland Europe, you will find anti-Islamic Brotherhood sentiments or anti-Islamic groups and organizations sentiments against those organizations. In America, in Israel, but the fourth one is the Middle Eastern regimes. Wherever a Middle Eastern regime rules, you will find, with the odd exceptions like Qatar, for instance, which works hand in hand with the
CIA.
Islamic Brotherhood. But this interested me for a while. Why I could understand why the regimes they do not look in eye to eye with the Islamic Brotherhood. But why America and Europe, mainland Europe and Israel, you'll find the common denominator. One of the reasons is because of the activities in Jerusalem today. In Jerusalem today, the Brotherhood is such a part and parcel of the Palestinian resistance that they are one of the reasons why the Masjid al-Aqsa is preserved today. So you have these shuyukh who are part of the Islamic Brotherhood, like Sheikh Ra'id Salah, who is in exile from Jerusalem by the Israeli authorities. But Ra'id Salah has good links with the Palestinian Jerusalem people and the Islamic Brotherhood with organizations like Hamas, who become a part of the Palestinian resistance. Now, to undermine the Palestinian resistance, you would have to undermine the Islamic Brotherhood. And this is why when the elections were won by the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt after the so-called Arab Spring, that was not good news for Israel, because the Gaza pass, the Gaza is the largest prison on earth, and the pass between Egypt and Palestine is Gaza. It's barred by the Israelis, so goods cannot enter Gaza. That pass would have been opened by the government in Egypt at that time, which was an Islamic Brotherhood government. So the Islamic Brotherhood has its friends and enemies. And most Muslims are neutral towards the Islamic Brotherhood. But uh, myself, for instance, I lived in Syria, and the Syrian regime is absolutely opposed to the Islamic Brotherhood because of the events in the early 1980s, which they saw as foreign agitation. And this is where you have the claims that the Islamic Brotherhood has been utilized in order to agitate civil war in countries like Syria. So in the 1980s, you had the events in Hama, and then recently the so-called Arab Spring,
Yeah, right.
and the revolutions, attempt at revolutions, and the civil war in Syria. So they see the Islamic Brotherhood, because the Assad regime, for instance, they also have propaganda. They say that the Islamic Brotherhood is a foreign tool. They claim that the Islamic Brotherhood is a foreign tool.
Right.
But when you talk to members of the Islamic Brotherhood, they say Assad is
Yeah. Right.
is a tool for foreign agencies also. But the reality is much more nuanced. The reality is much more nuanced. I'll break this down for you. In Syria, the majority population is Sunni, so they make up 80% of the population. The rest is 10% Christian, and then the Druze and the Nusayris. Now, the Nusayris are known as the Alawis, from which Bashar al-Assad hails, even though he himself claims to have adopted mainstream Sunni Islam. So, with the repression of the people, the 80%, the Islamic Brotherhood is seen as a political alternative by that some of those people in that majority, not all, but a large segment of the majority population see the Islamic Brotherhood as a replacement for the Assad regime. So when there is a clash between the Assad regime and the Islamic Brotherhood, the Assad regime claims that the Islamic Brotherhood is a foreign agent, but and the Brotherhood will claim that Assad is also a foreign agent. But in reality, it's a localized political clash, which personally I do not see either side as foreign agents. I do not see Bashar as an agent of Israel, and neither do I see the Brotherhood as an agent of Israel. But both sides can be agitated enough or equipped, like you had the fighters, some of these foreign fighters that entered Syria. They were equipped by people, and some of them were treated in Israel. So they were taken over the border in the Golan Heights in Julan, and they were treated by the Israelis. So this is where this gives credence to the claim. This gives credence to the claim that these foreign fighters, the Islamic Brotherhood, is a part of the foreign agents. But in reality, the foreign fighters are a different breed altogether. The foreign fighters, the fighters that came, many of them from Europe, the foreign fighters who were equipped, and they had an ISIS ideology. Now, ISIS is totally different to the Islamic Brotherhood. So the Islamic Brotherhood has its history, it has its ups and downs. Anwar Sadat was killed by a member of the Islamic Brotherhood, but he was also a part of the Egyptian army. You can say this is like the American, within America, you have people who are nationalists, who are a part of American identity, but they will have a strong Christian identity. And then you will have secular people within America, and both of them clash. One of them will claim one is a communist. The other one will claim the other one is an agent, a foreign tool. This is similar to what's happening in the Muslim world in Egypt. It's not as simple as saying the Islamic Brotherhood is funded by foreign powers, even though Hamas, just one point with regard to Hamas was initially in the 1980s allowed to act in the Palestinian territories by the Israeli authorities to undermine the PLO. This does not mean the essence of Hamas, Sheikh Yassin and the founders of Hamas, that they were insincere or that they were not sincere to Islam or they were not sincere to the Palestinian cause. It's just the Israeli policy at that time was to allow them to be active within the Palestinian territories in order to undermine the PLO. But later, this policy turned against Israel, because when Hamas won the elections, this was a disaster for Israel. They did not want them to win popular elections. So the Brotherhood wins popular elections in places like Egypt. It shows that it does resonate with a large segment of the Middle Eastern population. Straight away in Egypt, it was replaced with Sisi. So now Sisi rules with an iron fist, but he imprisoned the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood and he killed many of their members.
So, but going back to the origins, do you disagree with the account that some historians have given that al-Afghani himself was a British Secret Intelligence Service agent.
Yeah, so what I mentioned with regard to Al-Afghani, Abdu, and Rashid Rida, they were not the founders of the Islamic Brotherhood. They were infiltrators in the
Okay,
Azhar.
I see.
They were infiltrators in the Azhar, which I cited that as an example of how the British
Right.
attempted to meddle in religious affairs within Egypt. Within Egypt at that time, Hassan al-Banna was a distinct individual to those individuals that you mentioned. But al-Afghani was definitely an agent provocateur, a member of Masonic lodges by admission, meaning it's not even
Right. Exactly.
conspiratorial.
Right.
By admission, al-Afghani was a Freemason.
Now, this is in a period when, right after this period, with the establishment of the Saudi family, right, by the British Empire, the attempt to kind of control a caliphate. How would you characterize the Saudi branch of stuff and the figure of like a Bin Laden type of character? I mean, do you see that as really married to the Western power structure, the Anglo-American establishment, and perhaps even in the case of Bin Laden, the CIA?
So this story starts from the 1700s. So from the 1700s in Eastern Arabia, which is known as Najd, you have an old sheikh by the name of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, where you get the name Wahhabi.
Wahhabi.
Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. His father Abdul Wahhab was a pious Sunni sheikh, but Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, he was affected by a different theology altogether, and he deemed and declared all the Sunni Muslims and the Shias as being disbelievers. So he declared the entire Muslim world at that time as being disbelievers. And this was during a time when the British had started colonizing the Muslim world. So in the late 1600s, you had the colonizing of India, and in the 1700s, the colonizing of Kuwait. Kuwait was being colonized at that time. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab led a religious, Protestant type movement in the heartland of Islam, which is the Arabian Peninsula, which was governed by the Ottoman Caliphate at that time. A caliphate that had good ties and relationships with the world. How during the potato famine in Ireland, the Ottomans were the ones who sent aid to the Irish, and they sent ships to Ireland in order to alleviate some of the famine that the Irish were suffering. Queen Victoria stopped those ships. These were the types of foreign policies that the Ottoman Empire had at that time. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab led a zealous religious movement which became known as Wahhabism at that time. He made an alliance with a family, a clan, an Arabian tribe known as Al Saud. Al Saud, which is Saudi,
Mm-hmm.
which in English we say Saudi, and Saudi Arabia, by the way, Arabia prior to the Saudi dynasty was just known as Arabia, and it was under the Ottoman Caliphate. Saudi today is the only country in the world named after a family, Saudi Arabia, even though the
Right.
actual name of the place is Arabia. The alliance made with the Saudi royal family was the first secular alliance made in the Muslim world. Why was it secular? Because in the Muslim world, the caliph was the authority, a political authority and religious authority. So the Hajj, the yearly pilgrimage, the caliph was responsible for organizing the Hajj, for distributing the charity, the alms that were given, and all these various things. But the the alliance between the Saudis and the family of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, which became known as Al Sheikh, was that the Wahhabi clergy, they deal with religious affairs, and the Saudi royal family will deal with the religious affairs. So therefore, you had a division
Yeah.
of religion and state. This is why you would see that these Wahhabi clergy in Saudi Arabia, they will only interfere in ridiculous things like banning women from driving, which the ban has been lifted now, but it's not an Islamic law. It's their interpretation, similar to what you have in America. You'll have, imagine, well, the Amish are peaceful people, but imagine you had the Mormons uh, governing the religious affairs of people and giving verdicts, telling people that they cannot do certain things.
Right.
So at this point, you had the Wahhabis giving their own verdicts, banning women from driving or doing giving other verdicts, which are in accordance with Islam and some which are not. But they never interfere in those things which affect politics. So you would never hear a Wahhabi cleric who's aligned with the Saudi royal family giving a verdict prohibiting banking. So saying corporations cannot enter our peninsula. You never hear the ones who are aligned with the Saudi royal family giving a verdict that the American army, when it entered the Arabian Peninsula, that it's not permitted for them to enter in the 90s, in the first Gulf War, in the 1990s, in order to attack Iraq and Saddam Hussein. So the alliance that was made, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, which you mentioned, Osama bin Laden, firstly, he comes from a large family, and you must be aware of the alliances between the family of Bush and the family of bin Laden's, meaning they have good ties. But bin Laden has many siblings. Some of those siblings are in fact Sufis, are not Wahhabis. But Osama bin Laden himself is a Wahhabi, meaning the creed he adopted was a Wahhabi creed. And he joined what they termed as being the jihad in Afghanistan. Now, the resistance in Afghanistan to communism, Islamically, is a jihad. Muslims recognize that because Muslims deem communism as disbelief, as would Eastern Orthodox. So the jihad was legitimate in that sense. But the ISI in Pakistan needed, meaning the Pakistan at that time was a good friend, an ally of America at that time. The CIA and the ISI worked hand in hand in order to recruit fighters, train them in North Pakistan, and then send them over the border into Afghanistan. Many of those recruits came from those groups which were banned in the Middle East. So you had the likes of the Islamic Brotherhood. And by the way, the leaders of the Brotherhood were not extremists like Azzam, Abdullah Azzam, Azzam, a Palestinian resistance fighter in Afghanistan, was not an extremist. He went to fight communism, but he was not the brand of resistance fighters that we see in ISIS. And ISIS were in fact not formulated at the time, but ISIS has killed more Muslims than it has killed non-Muslims. ISIS itself, if you check, they have killed more Muslims than non-Muslims. But Abdullah Azzam was not extreme, but bin Laden was associated with him in the initial stages. But many of them moved away from Abdullah Azzam because they did not find his views compatible with their own views. So what happened at that time is when these fighters returned from Afghanistan, so the war was from 79 to 89. Many people see this as a victory, but personally I see that there was a loss of human life, unnecessary loss. Over 1 million Afghanis died. 15,000 Russians died, soldiers. Meaning if you do the mathematics, 1 million Afghanis dying, civilians, in comparison with 15,000 Russian soldiers dying, it was not really a victory in that sense. Like Vietnam was never a victory for America. So when bin Laden returns back to Saudi Arabia, he sees that Saudi Arabia now is clashing with Saddam Hussein. Now, Saddam Hussein is not a Wahhabi. Saddam Hussein religiously speaking, is Sunni,
Right.
religiously speaking, but he's secular.
Mm-hmm.
So his Baathist party is secular. He has Christians in the government. He has everyone, various groups in the government. And there is a clash between Saddam Hussein and the Saudi royal family in the early 90s. Bin Laden invited the Saudi royal family to permit him to have his register of recruits, which were known as Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda means the base.
The base. Yeah.
That those fighters can be called into Saudi Arabia and fight Saddam Hussein at that time. When the Saudis refused, because the Saudis were allies of America, they wanted the American troops to come in. And this shows that Muslims are able to fight their own wars. They do not need foreign intervention, meaning that the number of recruits were available. But America, Saudi Arabia bankrolled America in order to fight the war on their behalf. And then Osama bin Laden left for Sudan. So his history in Sudan is well known. And then the pharmaceutical buildings were bombed by Clinton, I think, in 1998. And then he moved to Afghanistan. And then we had the 9/11 events. But bin Laden ideologically and theologically was a Wahhabi,
Right.
had Wahhabi doctrine. And then later what we saw is that the ISIS group was a Frankenstein monster created from that period.
Right. Yeah.
And the space for them to create what they called ISIS, meaning Islamic State, which we wouldn't recognize as an Islamic State, that territory which they carved out in Iraq and Syria, they were only able to do that because of the invasions in 2003. Meaning, if America had not invaded Iraq in 2003, and if the revolutions or the Arab Spring, the fighters were not armed by foreign powers, then there would have been no space for a group like ISIS to activate itself in that region. So ideologically, the story goes back from the 1700s all the way up to 79, and then from 79 to 2001, and then 2001 to more recently 2014. And then this man, Abu Bakr Baghdadi, an unknown figure who appears and declares himself as a caliph, and to this day, he is unknown in the Muslim world. And then now we are in 2021. These are all the historical events that have transpired.
Right, but I guess the direct question was more so about what usage bin Laden could have been to Western intelligence. And I say that because there is a significant amount of evidence to suggest that. But let me give you another example of what I was getting at, which you kind of touched on earlier, but the former CIA operative Robert Baer stated, for example, at the bottom of all this was a little dirty secret in Washington, and the White House looked on the Muslim Brotherhood as a silent ally, a secret weapon against communism. Covert action started in the 1950s via the Dulles brothers, Allen Dulles, right? Allen at the CIA and John Foster at the State Department when they approved of Saudi Arabia's funding of the Egyptian Brotherhood against Nasser. As far as Washington was concerned, Nasser was a communist. He had nationalized Egypt's business industries, and including the Suez Canal. The logic of the Cold War then led to a clear conclusion. If Allah agreed to fight on the side of the West, then fine. If Allah decided political assassination was permissible, that was fine too, as long as no one talked about it in polite company. Like any other truly effective covert action, this one was strictly off the books. There was no CIA finding or no memorandum that could be mentioned in Congress. Not a penny came out of the Treasury. In other words, it was not on record. All the White House had to do was to give a wink and a nod to countries that harbored the Muslim Brotherhood, like Saudi Arabia and Jordan. So I'm just curious as to how you would you agree or disagree with the take that Robert Baer has?
Yes. There? So Gamal Abdel Nasser, 1950s, the unification of Syria and Egypt. Gamal Abdel Nasser was despised by the West. So when they needed political agitators within Egypt or Syria in order to undermine Gamal Abdel Nasser, they did utilize Islamic organizations and groups to achieve that goal. Gamal Abdul Nasir, as well as the Shah of Iran, in the Shah of Iran with Mossadegh, meaning Shah of Iran
Yeah.
was
CIA. He
initially
was put
CIA
in by the
asset.
CIA. Yeah.
He was a CIA asset, and he was used against his own father. And then when Mossadegh came into power in the 1950s, he came through a popular vote. But the Shah of Iran again was utilized against him to undermine him. Like this, different groups in the Muslim world are utilized against one another, meaning it's not specific to the Brotherhood. It's not specific to the Brotherhood.
Yes. Right.
It's across the spectrum. Um, an example of this, I had a friend who passed away now. He was a journalist. He passed away in his 70s. His name was Abdul Qadir Ayman, an Englishman, and meaning an indigenous English. And he accepted Islam also. He said to me when he went to Palestine in the 1980s, he met an English priest. So this is your English Anglican priests.
Yeah.
So he said to him, how many Muslims have you converted to Christianity in your time in Palestine? And the priest said in response, and remember this, I'm citing this not because of his Christianity, it's because of his Anglican origins, meaning the King Henry VIII.
Yeah, right. British Empire, right? And
Yeah.
many of the Anglican priests and ministers and missionaries were in fact spies. So yeah.
So he said, we do not come here to convert Muslims. We come here to give them hammers. Hammers. So he said, I inquired, what did he mean by hammers? He said hammers to break each other up. So that the hammers are given to various factions in the Muslim world in order that they break themselves up, like the Shia and Sunni in Iraq today. So you have the Shia in Iraq division in Iraq today. That division should not translate into sectarian violence, but it has, because it can be manipulated. Likewise, in Northern Ireland, between the Catholics and the Protestants, the British have a way of playing one group against the other. So in England, for instance, where I live, the working class, the white working class, will have grievances with the establishment. But in order to undermine those grievances, you give them minority groups to clash with. So if you distract the working class, the white working class, majority people with minority groups, that will distract them from the ruling elite, meaning the people who are causing the problems.
I understand.
So this is what they do across the spectrum.
Yeah, and another example is the way British intelligence infiltrated and utilized the IRA. Now, I'm not saying that makes the IRA good, but they would infiltrate and they would stir up a bunch of tension, right? And this would dissolve the coherence of the Irish, right, or any kind of movement against the British. But that's another example of doing this is to, for example, if immigrants, right, move into an area, then the blame is placed on the immigrants when it's not actually the immigrants' fault. It's the fault of the power structure that is intentionally clashing the civilizations.
So I'm sure they do that in Texas with the minorities coming in, and the majority people will have problems with the power structure, and they would make them clash with the immigrants and the migrants who move into Texas.
Well, yeah, in America, it manifests in different ways, but primarily, it would be border conflicts. And a lot of people aren't aware, for example, that a big part of the poverty in Mexico is a result of NAFTA. So back when NAFTA was passed in the late 80s, early 90s, whenever that was, that caused a lot of poverty in Mexico and caused a lot of people wanting to flee Mexico to come to the U.S. And really, it only benefits, the Fortune 100 and the top 1%. So it's very sad that that's the way it works, but that's what happens. Another example, too, I wanted to add just kind of an additional point that a lot of people aren't aware of. You're probably aware of this, but another example of this is the funding. If you look into the funding of these groups, you'll often find kind of a trail that leads to, shady characters. And a lot of the Afghan war, that kind of stuff, even Bin Laden, there seems to be clear connections to the BCCI, which was a shady CIA front bank that was connected to the Iran Contra scandal. And the BCCI was really just a cutout for the CIA to funnel money to different projects. And so they have sent money in many cases before it fell apart, right, to radical organizations. Are you familiar with that? Did you know what I'm talking about?
Your question was what more specifically?
I was just adding. I wasn't asking a question. I was just sort of adding on to the point that if you look into the Bank for Credit and Commerce International, which was a famous CIA cutout bank, it was a way by which they would funnel money to a lot of radical organizations. So I wasn't asking a question. I was just sort of adding to your point that you were making.
Yeah. So when they need to do that, they allow the pool of money reach these kind of groups.
Mm-hmm.
But when they need to hack away the resources, they stop funneling those funds to such type of groups.
Let me ask you a question about another character that pops up sometimes. See what your take is. What about the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem? Because he seems to be an interesting character that was, as far as I could tell, a British intelligence creation. Do you agree with that?
I'm unfamiliar of which particular Mufti you mean. Do you mean the one in
the one that they show? Like, there's always a famous picture of him shaking hands with Hitler, and he's the first one, I think.
Yeah, so the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem would not have existed during the time of the Ottoman Caliphate. So the Caliphate had a Shaykh al-Islam who would be the Grand Mufti for the Ottoman Caliphate. The last one was Mustafa Sabri. So Shaykh al-Islam, Mustafa Sabri, Sabri, S-A-B-R-I, he was the last official Shaykh al-Islam and Mufti of the Caliphate. Post-Caliphate,
right.
You have different muftis being propped up as being official muftis of different various regions, and they vary. You get good ones and you get people who may give verdicts which are totally incorrect.
Well, I'm speaking of the one that is famous for the famous photo of him and Hitler, sort of making.
Yes, I'm not too familiar with him, but I do remember seeing the picture with him and Hitler. And funnily enough, locally here in Birmingham, in England, we have an elderly man who's met Hitler also in jail. So there's a Muslim fighter who was a part of the British Army and was imprisoned in Germany, and he actually met Hitler also. So the historicity of Hitler and his meeting with various Muslims, some of the Zionists attempt to utilize that photo to undermine Palestinian resistance in order to say that the Palestinians are pro-Hitler or the Palestinians are anti-Semitic, which they cannot be because they are Semitic. The Jews that we have, the majority of them are in fact European.
Right.
Meaning,
well, it's actually what I'm thinking of is there's in Lost Hegemon, which is a book by F. William Engdahl. He covers this meeting, and his point was not to undermine, but it was arguing that the Grand Mufti was an agent of Israel. So I'm not Israel, of Britain. That the Grand Mufti was an asset of Britain, and I actually think that Hitler actually was a useful, tolerated person by the British Empire for many years. In fact, Quigley suggests that as well, that the British wanted and goaded Hitler to do what he did for many years. The appeasement program. They had a secret. It's called the dual policy. There's a whole chapter in Quigley about this. That really, the Hitler functions.
You're familiar with the Queen's husband,
yeah,
and being a part of the the Nazi SS.
Yeah, well, the previous king was he was a open Nazi, so absolutely. I mean, there's a very there's a lot of people that theorize. Some even go so far as to say that Hitler actually was an asset of the British Empire, which he's at least a useful tool of the British Empire. Whether he's a total full-on asset, I don't know about that, but
The Mufti, you mean Al-Amin al-Husseini? Al-Amin
that sounds
al-Husseini.
right. That sounds right.
But I'm not too familiar with his role, but that's something to look into.
Yeah, have you read that book, Lost Hegemon by Ephraim Ingdahl? It's a pretty good book.
No,
Yeah,
no, I've not read that book.
he's just he's an intelligence analyst giving analysis. He's not neocon. He's very anti neocon. So he's a pretty good source. But yeah, he makes that connection. I think Mark Curtis speaks to this as well in his book Secret Affairs, which is really good. But anyway, yeah, that's getting kind of way off. But is there any other areas that you feel that are relevant to like maybe a more general question that a lot of people in the West would like to know is like what is the attitude that you would say towards kind of radicalization? Do you view it the same way that we would view like really radical fundamentalist Christian sects?
So,
Is that how you would say it?
with radicalization, if you check these websites uh, that are made in the US or mainland Europe, you will find that they will categorize even Muslims who have normative Islamic views as being radicals. So if you are anti-establishment or anti-globalization or anti-democracy, because in Islam, democracy is not compatible with Islam.
Right.
They are polarized, because in Islam we have a caliphate system, which has a Majlis Shura, which is a consultative body that governs the Islamic world. So these groups and organizations that you have that advise governments as to who is a radical will lump mainstream Muslims with actual radicals, people who have actual extremist views. Actual extremist views are people who believe in killing of civilians, killing of women and children, suicide bombing, these type of things. These type of people are actual radicals. But having an alternative model, presenting an alternative model of governance for the world is not radicalization according to normative Islam, meaning we propose the caliphate in the Muslim world as an alternative model to corporate capitalism to govern the Muslim world, not to govern the Western world, but the effects will resonate with the rest of the world. The effects will resonate with the rest of the world, because if we do away with corporate banking, we do away with interest and usury, and corporations cannot plunder the wealth of the world, or at least the wealth of the Muslim nations, the effects of that will be felt throughout Africa, for instance, the African continent, South America, and throughout the developing world also. So radicalization is viewed differently in America, in mainland Europe, not Britain as much. Britain is very multicultural now, meaning London and Birmingham, the main cities, if you come out, they have a lot of interaction with Muslims in comparison with other places. So the how I would term anyone as being radical is someone who is willing to break the law and additionally to undermine the law and kill and maim people. These are people who are radicals.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you another question, just out of my own personal curiosity. The whole history of Iran is fascinating, and I know that you're not Shia, obviously, but what is your attitude towards a country like Iran, religiously speaking? I mean, is it just generally viewed as the way we would see a group that's heretical? Is it, in a loose sense, a cultural ally, or is it just really weird? Or how do you view Iran?
So Iran is more complex and more complicated than we think. Firstly, in Iran, we have the Persian culture, I mean, culturally, they are Persian. That I can relate to, Persian culture and Persian history. But religiously speaking, many Iranians are actually secular. So they have a secular view. So when conversing with a secular Iranian, I may be able to culturally resonate with them and discuss things in a secular manner. But religiously speaking, the Sunni population of Iran is suppressed. So you have them in certain regions, but they mainly are suppressed. In Tehran, you may not even have the presence of Sunni Muslims. Religiously speaking, let's say theoretically, the Iranian mullah now is a Sunni. Would I say Iran is an Islamic state? So we replaced the Ayatollah Khamenei with the caliph the way he is today. Would I say it's a caliphate? The answer is no. In fact, it's a republic, a socialist type republic. It's a socialist state, given the trappings of a Shia Islamic republic. Because when you have the words Islamic and republic, it's a contradiction.
Yeah, it seems weird,
Yeah, so it's like having a Christian republic.
Yeah, right.
Islamic republic is a contradiction because you can have Islamic state, which is basically a Majlis Shura, a consultative body which elects a man who becomes the caliph, rules the judiciary, the military, and the economy is ruled by Sharia law. So the Sharia law governs the judiciary, the criminal punishments. And it's interesting for your viewers to know that Christians and other minorities, they govern according to their own laws. So, Jay, if you were living under me as a caliph, technically I wouldn't be a caliph because I'm not Qurayshi, but if I was a judge, I would say to you, you now live according to your Christian law. The state will very rarely intervene in the Christian community. So they'll take the jizya, which is the tax, a very small amount, less than the amount they take from Muslims. So Muslims are taxed more. They'll protect the Christians, but they will say you have your own courts, your own judges, and you rule by your own law. For the most part, the state will not intervene. This is why even in Muslim countries, the church bells ring openly. So in Damascus, you won't get the adhan openly in Britain, in America, in other places. Additionally, it's prohibited for Muslims to preach to Christian children. We are not permitted to preach to Christian children. Christian children are banned from reading the Quran. They cannot read the Quran. Not only Christians, other minorities. Their children are not permitted to read and study the Quran. So if we had a curriculum, one curriculum is not enforced upon all, like the Western capitalism, Western capitalist states. We have one curriculum for everyone. In a Muslim country, the Muslims study a Muslim curriculum. The Christians will have their own curriculum. The Hindus will have their own curriculum. They are autonomous within the caliphate. So this is something very rarely mentioned by CNN or Fox News. So Iran, for instance, is not governing like the way a caliphate would be. So I would see Iran as more of a secular, socialist state with the trappings of Shia Islam, of Shiaism, because there's no such thing as Shia Islam. There's only Islam, but of Shiaism. So it has the trappings of Shiaism, but it's really a secular socialist state.
Interesting. Gotcha. Well, we've gone for a good while here. This has been a good conversation. We've gone for almost an hour and a half. So we'll go ahead and take the questions from the audience here and see if we get some interesting comments here. Now, there was a comment from last night's discussion on that atheist debate that I missed. Let me see what that was. Somebody said, have you read the book Freemasonry Unmasked by Monsignor Dillon? Yes, I have. That was Copenhagener, $5. Yeah, I read that many years ago. It's a, kind of a typical approach that a traditional Catholic would write about Freemasonry. If you, it's what you would expect. It's not a terrible book. It's kind of dated, but yeah, it's worth reading. Dyer, Fanboy, $30. Dyer lives live every day. The nerds are eternally grateful and grateful to you. Greetings from a humble Dyerite. Well, I don't like people using that term Dyerite because, you know, I'm not a guru. Don't follow me. We are Orthodox. So I would just say don't use that word, but thank you for your donation. Mick Ale, $5. Thank you for doing my homework. Well, hopefully this is helpful to get different perspectives. There's definitely a lot of insight geopolitically where we would agree with Sheikh Asrar Rashid. So you're getting some different perspectives. I hope you guys appreciate that. And I don't know exactly. We'll come up with a date in the next in the near future as to when we can set up our full-on formal debate. It will be a formal setting. It won't be an informal debate. But today we just wanted to kind of talk about geopolitics and look at the relationship between religion and intelligence world. Big Bala, $3. How do I find the Fortune 500 companies that support socialism? All of them. I mean, pretty much most of them. So I can easily solve that question for you. Genon, $20. Thank you for today for the history lesson. Well, thank you, Genon TV, for your $20 donation. And as I said, Sheikh Rashid has a new book out, which is Islam Answers Atheism, which I do intend to get that book pretty soon.
Here's the book.
So there's his book. If you want his book, is it a better place to get it on Amazon or somewhere else? Or
so currently it's on. It's number one seller on Amazon.co.uk. I knocked Sam Harris off the first ranking. Sam Harris from America, and Darren Brown, another atheist from the UK.
Yeah, he used to have that TV show where he would go around and do like magic tricks.
Yeah. So this book, it's 392 pages, and it was available on Amazon.co.uk. Then it's gone to print because it's sold out, and it will be available again mid-March to late March. So have a look on Amazon, or just do a Google search, and hopefully you'll find distributors for the book.
And I've got a link to your Facebook page. Is that the best place, or should people look for your material somewhere else?
So there's a YouTube page as well, Asrar Rashid Official.
Okay.
That's a YouTube page. And any videos of mine, you can find them on Asrar Rashid Official, also the Facebook page. And hopefully in the future, your debate will, inshallah, God willing. I'm sure most of your American audience are familiar with Inshallah from Rambo 3 when he fights the Russians.
Well, he teams up with the Mujahideen, doesn't he?
Yeah. So they weren't, at that time, Reagan didn't see them as terrorists.
Right, I'm aware, yeah.
Freedom fighters. And in fact, the film was dedicated to the Mujahideen.
Mm-hmm.
This reminds me of your book as well, Esoteric Hollywood, which I've gotten in my library.
Oh. Thank you. That's cool. Yeah. There's also one of the Bond, the Living Daylights, I think, with Timothy Dalton. In that, he fights with the Mujahideen as well. So
Muslims who consider films as haram, they don't need to watch movies and films. They can get books like Esoteric Hollywood, and they would need to read through that and know about films like Eyes Wide Shut and whatnot, which contain haram, prohibited things, but by reading the book, you don't need to watch the movie itself.
It tells you what the meaning and the degeneracy in Hollywood is all about. But so everybody, if you want to, you can check out and follow his work. I'll add his channel as well. And then I think we did decide on a topic for was it Trinity and Christology?
So what was the debate Christology? So Eastern Orthodox Christology.
Okay.
Not the other sect, and the divine attributes in Islam.
Yeah.
So which one of them is representative of the true God? So we both believe in one God, but what the debate was revolving around, the Ash'ari creed or the Sunni mainstream creed versus the Eastern Orthodox creed, and how the Eastern Orthodox view Jesus. So that is an upcoming debate, inshallah. God willing, that we will have that debate.
Yeah.
And I'm sure your audience and my audience will be waiting and anticipating that debate.
Yes, and I am multiple chapters into the Sanusi or the Sanufi book.
Yes, Sanusi Creed.
Yeah.
So the Sanusi Creed. Just to tell some of our listeners, I gave Jay to read Sanusi Creed, Taftazani's Creed, Joanni's Creed, so many various books.
Yes, yeah, I've got those. All right, everybody, thank you for today's show, or thank you, Sheikh Asrar, for coming and having this discussion. Appreciate it, and wish you well, and we will talk again soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.